She hadn't spoken in years, not because she couldn't, but because no one ever listened. Until the day her voice shattered the silence and saved them both. She hadn't spoken in years, not because she couldn't, but because no one ever listened. Until the day her voice shattered the silence and saved them both. The sun burned hot above the empty plains, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer like water, though there is none, only dust and dry grass bending beneath the wind. A little girl walked there alone, her bare feet cut and raw from stones, her thin dress hanging loose and torn at the hem. She was small, no more than 9, and her face was streaked with dirt and sweat. Yet she made no sound, no cry, no plea for help. Her lips stayed shut, her throat held tight, because words had long ago been locked inside her. Silence was all she had left. Silence was her shield. Each step she took sent small puffs of dust rising, and each one felt heavier than the last. Behind her, in the far distance, a rider moved across the horizon, a speck of dark shifting through the glare. She did not need to look twice to know who it was. She could feel the weight of his shadow even with the sun in her eyes. The stepfather who had broken more than her trust was searching, and he would not stop. Still she pressed on, her small shoulders hunched, her head bowed against the heat, her thin arms wrapped tight around her middle, as if she could hold herself together that way. The land stretched wide and empty. No trees, no streams, just endless dirt broken by patches of yellow weeds. Buzzards circled far above as if waiting, and once a rattlesnake hissed when she passed too close to a rock, but she kept moving. The pain in her feet was sharp, the thirst burning her tongue almost too much to bear. But worse than that was the thought of hands dragging her back, of being locked again in a place where she could not escape. She had no words for prayer, no voice to call out for mercy, but in her chest, something stubborn beat harder than fear. She would not go back. Hours passed, and the light shifted toward gold, the long shadows stretching across the prairie. She stumbled often now, knees scraping against the dirt, but when she lifted her eyes, she saw it, faint and small in the distance, a shape against the horizon that did not belong to grass or stone. A roof, a chimney, a corral post sticking above the land, a ranch house. For a moment her chest tightened with something close to hope, though it was heavy with doubt too. People had turned her away before, told her she was trouble, unwanted, too strange with her voiceless ways. What if this place was the same? She pushed on anyway, dragging one foot after the other, her breath ragged, her hair tangled across her face. Behind her the rider still moved closer, the pounding of hooves faint but steady, carrying the threat of being caught. She did not look back this time. All that mattered was the faint shape ahead, the promise of walls, of a door, of someone who might open it. The sky bled with the red of sundown as the girl finally fell to her knees within sight of the corral, the dust rising around her like smoke. She pressed her palms to the ground, swallowed the dryness in her throat, and forced herself up once more. She had nothing left but her silence, yet in that silence burned the will to keep moving, and so she did, toward whatever waited at that lonely ranch house on the edge of the world. Ethan Cole rose each morning before the sun climbed, his days shaped by the rhythm of cattle and dust, and the silence that filled his land was the only company he trusted. He had once known laughter here, when his wife was alive, when there was talk at the supper table and the sound of a fiddle on summer nights, but that was long gone. And in the years since he had grown used to the quiet. The cattle didn't answer back, the wind didn't demand anything of him, and that suited him fine. He was a man who kept to himself, his face lined from sun and sorrow, his voice seldom used, except to call the dogs or curse at a broken fence. That afternoon the air was heavy with heat, the sky wide and bright, when he saw something by the corral fence that did not belong. At first he thought it was a bundle of cloth dropped from a passing wagon, but when he came closer he saw it was a child, curled in the dust, her hair tangled, her skin smudged with dirt. Her dress clung to her like rags, and her bare feet were cut raw from miles of ground. She did not move until he crouched beside her, and even then, it was only her eyes that opened, dark and wide, filled with something he knew too well, the look of someone who had run too far with nothing left to run on. Ethan frowned, scratching the back of his neck, not sure what to make of her. Strays had found their way to his land before. Starved dogs, hungry men, even a half-dead horse once. And always he had taken them in for a night and then sent them on their way. He did not like the thought of being tied to anyone, not anymore. Yet there was something in this girl's silence that caught him. She didn't beg, didn't weep, didn't say a word, only lay there with her gaze locked on him as if waiting for his judgment. He lifted her carefully, light as a sack of feathers, and carried her toward the house. She tensed at his touch, but she did not fight him, just clutched the torn edge of her dress as though it were all she had left. He set her down by the kitchen table, poured her a cup of water, and pushed it gently toward her. She drank like someone who hadn't tasted water in days, but still, no sound came from her throat. Ethan asked her name once, twice, and when she gave no answer, he let the question die in the air. To him she looked like another burden the world had dropped at his feet, another weight he hadn't asked for, and he almost told her she could not stay. Yet those eyes, haunted and hollow, kept him still. He knew what it was to be lost, to be left behind, and he could not bring himself to send her back into the dust. So he said nothing more, only set bread on the table, laid a blanket near the fire, and let her sit there in silence, as if silence was something he could finally share. The girl sat at his table with her shoulders hunched and her small hands folded in her lap, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to touch anything more than what he had already given her. Ethan set bread on the plate and pushed a cup of water toward her, waiting for some sign she was more than a shadow dragged in from the dust. She only lifted the bread with careful fingers, broke it in half, and ate in small bites like she was afraid it would vanish if she took too much. Her eyes never left the table, though once or twice they flicked up to him, quick and guarded, like a stray animal checking if the hand that fed it might still strike. Ethan cleared his throat and asked her name. The sound of his own voice felt too loud in the quiet kitchen, echoing off the walls. She froze, her lips pressed tight, her dark eyes watching him without answering. He tried again, slower this time, softer, as though gentleness might coax the words out. Nothing came. He saw her throat work as if something stirred there, but no sound followed. He leaned back, rubbed a hand over his jaw, and told himself she must be mute. He had heard of it before. Children born without words, people struck by sickness or accident, until silence was all they had. But as he watched her, he wondered if it was not the body that failed her, but something deeper. There was a kind of strain in her face, a tightness, as if the words were there but trapped, locked so far inside she no longer knew how to free them. He did not press her. Pressing had never done him any good either. So he let the silence stand, heavy but not cruel, and kept on with his supper as if she were any other guest who had nothing to say. When she finished eating, he brought a blanket and set it by the fire, motioning for her to lie down. She looked at him, almost startled, as if she expected to be sent back out into the dark. He gave a small shrug, nothing more, and left her to it. She curled beneath the blanket, her thin frame almost disappearing, but he noticed the way her eyes stayed open, watching the firelight flicker against the walls, unwilling or unable to let sleep take her. Ethan sat in his chair a while longer, pipe in hand though he never lit it, thinking how strange it was to have another soul under his roof again. He had grown used to silence, but this was a different kind. Hers was not the quiet of peace or choice, but of fear coiled tight like a snake that never unbent. He told himself she was nothing to him, just a stray he had taken in for the night. Yet as he watched the blanket rise and fall with her shallow breaths, he felt something old stir in him, something he thought had died with his wife. He did not know what this girl would be to him, nor what he was to her, But for now he let the fire burn low and shared his roof with her silence. The days stretched into one another the way they always did on Ethan's ranch, marked by the rising and setting of the sun, by the long shadows that drifted across the corrals, by the steady sound of cattle lowing in the fields. But now there was something different inside those days, a quiet presence that moved like a shadow through the rooms of his house and trailed close behind him when he went out to work. The girl never spoke, never called his name, never even tried to explain who she was or where she had come from, yet her silence filled every space she touched. Ethan found himself listening for it even when he was alone in the barn, measuring the weight of her silence against his own. He noticed things about her, small things that told stories without words. The way her shoulders would stiffen whenever a door slammed against the wind. The way she shrank into herself when the dogs barked too close, or when a horse snorted loud in the corral. Her hands were always moving, clutching the hem of her dress, twisting the blanket at night, as if her body carried more fear than she could hold inside. When Ethan reached out once, only to move her aside near the trough, she flinched so hard it made his chest tighten. He pulled his hand back, not angry, only heavy with understanding. He had known men and women both who carried scars no one could see, wounds that made them twitch at shadows and stiffen at kindness. He did not need words to know what she had endured. When he took her into town for supplies, the difference showed even clearer. She clung close to him, her small frame pressed in tight whenever someone passed too near. Her eyes darted from one face to another, searching for judgment, for danger, and always finding enough to keep her head bowed. People noticed. They always noticed. In a place as small as this, where everyone's story was told and retold until it became half gossip, half truth, the sight of a silent child at Ethan Cole's side set tongues wagging. "She's cursed," one woman whispered outside the mercantile, her eyes wide with something between pity and suspicion. "A child that doesn't speak ain't natural." "Broken," another muttered, shaking his head as Ethan walked past, his arms full of grain sacks. "Not worth the trouble, Cole. You'd be wise to send her back where she came from." Ethan heard them. He heard every word, but he did not slow his step, nor did he answer. The years had taught him that some wounds did not need to be displayed to be real, and some truths were not meant for other people's judgment. He carried his silence the way he always had, steady and unbending, letting the words fall useless against his back. That night, when they returned to the ranch, the girl sat near the fire, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes watching the flames. Ethan sat across from her, weary but calm, and though neither spoke, there was an understanding between them. She was not cursed, not broken. She was simply carrying the weight of shadows, just as he was. And if the world wanted to call that strange, let it. Inside these walls, silence did not mean weakness. It meant survival. The mornings on the ranch always started the same, with the sun spreading slow across the fields and the smell of dust warming in the air. Ethan rose early, fed the horses, checked the fences, and the girl trailed after him like a shadow that made no sound. She never tried to speak, and he never pushed her to. But one afternoon, while he was mending a post by the corral, he saw her crouched near the barn, a stick in her hand, scratching shapes into the dirt. At first he thought it was only the restless play of a child, but when he came closer he saw more. There were lines that looked like a house with a crooked roof, circles that might have been horses, and then, drawn darker and heavier, a figure holding what was clear enough to him, a belt raised high. Ethan stood a long moment, watching her. She didn't see him. Or maybe she did and didn't care. Her small hand moving quick and sharp, as if spilling something too heavy to keep inside. He felt a tightness in his chest, the kind that came when old memories stirred, things he didn't want to recall. He did not ask questions. He did not need to. The dirt spoke plain enough. When she noticed him standing there, her eyes went wide for a moment, like she expected him to be angry. Ethan only bent down, picked up a smaller stick, and drew beside her, He scratched the shape of a circle, then tapped it, then pointed at the water trough. "Water," he said, plain and steady. She blinked, tilted her head, then touched the circle and looked at him. He nodded. She drew another line, and he answered again, this time with the word safe, pressing his palm against his chest. Slowly, carefully, he showed her simple things, the signs of his hands moving as steady as his voice. She followed, hesitantly at first, but then with a kind of hunger, repeating the signs back, testing them like a new language built from silence. Food, water, safe, no. Her fingers curled and stretched, mimicking his, and when he nodded in approval, a faint light came into her eyes. They spent the better part of that afternoon bent over the dust, the stick drawing shapes and his hands teaching signs, until the sun lowered and the sky turned soft with evening. Over the days that followed, she began using the signs without prompting. When she was hungry, she touched her lips. When she was tired, she rested her head against her hands. When something startled her, she raised her palm sharp in a gesture of no. Ethan answered in kind, his silence not heavy now but shared, and between them there grew a kind of language that belonged only to the two of them. One evening, as the fire crackled low, she used her small hands to sign safe, then looked at him as if to ask if it was true. Ethan nodded once, slow and certain, and though she still did not speak, he saw her shoulders ease. The weight she carried lightened for a moment. The silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like trust beginning to take root. The evening light stretched long across the plains, painting the grass in streaks of gold and red, the kind of light that made the world seem calm, even when danger lurked just beyond the horizon. Ethan had been out by the corral, leaning against a post with his hat tipped low, when he saw the first flicker of movement in the distance. Dust rose in thin trails, stirred by horses' hooves, and soon he counted 3 riders, their figures dark against the glow of the sinking sun. Something about the way they moved, slow and searching, set his teeth on edge. These were not men traveling through, not men on their way home. They were hunting. He stayed there, watching, his hand brushing the butt of his rifle, though he didn't raise it yet. The riders came closer until he could make out their shapes more clearly. 2 were ordinary enough, broad-shouldered men, rough from the trail. But the one in front drew Ethan's eye. A man with sharp eyes, a cruel tilt to his mouth, the sort of face that didn't need words to tell its story. Even at a distance, Ethan could feel the weight of it, the authority of someone used to being feared. Behind him, the sound of the door creaked. The girl had been watching from the window, her small hands gripping the sill. Ethan turned his head and saw her face drain of what little color it had. Her eyes locked on the man in front, as if she knew him, as if his very presence reached across the fields and clawed into her chest. Her lips parted as though she might make a sound, but no word came. Only silence, the silence of recognition, the silence of fear. Ethan felt something heavy settle inside him then, a truth forming like thunder in his bones. She was not simply lost. She had not wandered here by chance. She had been running from something, from someone, and that someone had found his way to Ethan's land. The riders slowed near the edge of the property, scanning the corral, the house, the barn. Ethan stood still, his stance casual, but his heart steady with warning. He tipped his hat lower, masking his face in shadow, waiting for them to make their move. The man in front pulled his horse up short, surveying the spread with eyes that missed little. His gaze lingered on the window for a breath too long, and Ethan knew he had caught the outline of the girl before she ducked away. Inside the house, she stumbled back from the window, her chest heaving, her hands twisting together in frantic signs Ethan couldn't ignore. She pressed her palms out, shaking her head, then curled in on herself as if she might disappear. Ethan stepped in, laying a firm hand on her shoulder, steadying her trembling frame. He didn't need her to speak to know what she was telling him. This man was no stranger. This was the shadow that had been chasing her across the plains. Ethan looked once more through the window, his jaw set tight. He had lived years alone, years where nothing and no one mattered, where silence was his only companion. But now, there was this girl, broken but breathing under his roof, and the man outside wanted to take her back into darkness. Ethan's hand drifted again toward his rifle, not for show, not for threat, but for promise. Whatever story had brought her here, it was his story now too, and he would not let her be dragged away. The fire snapped and hissed as the night wind pressed against the walls, carrying the smell of dust and horses from the corrals. Ethan sat in his chair, boots heavy on the floor, a pipe in his hand though he hadn't lit it, staring into the flames, as if the answer he needed might rise up out of the coals. The girl was curled on the rug nearby, her thin frame wrapped tight in that ragged shawl she never let go of, the edges worn and frayed, but clutched to her chest like it was the only piece of her past she wanted to keep. She hadn't made a sound since she'd seen the riders on the horizon. Her silence was deeper than usual, a silence filled with fear, and Ethan felt the weight of it pressing against him harder than the wind outside. He told himself again that she was not his kin, not his blood, not his burden. He had not asked for her, had not invited her into his house, had not promised her anything. The world had dropped her here like a stone in his path, and he had picked her up out of habit more than choice. If he turned her away, no one could call him wrong for it. It wasn't his fight. He had fought his own battles, lost his own people, and earned his peace the hard way. Trouble was a thing he had no need for anymore. But when he looked at her lying there, so small beneath that old shawl, her dark eyes open and fixed on the fire, as though she was holding herself awake against memories she dared not dream, Ethan felt the old walls inside him shift. He remembered the hollow years after his wife had died, the way silence had filled the house like a second skin, choking him, pressing against his chest, until some days he thought it might smother him. He had walked through rooms too empty, eaten meals too quiet, worked days where the only sound was his own breath. He had lived in that silence, until it nearly broke him. Now here was this child who lived in silence too, not by choice but by fear, a silence forced upon her by hands that should have protected her, but instead had wounded her deeper than words could show. Ethan felt something stir inside him that he had not felt in years, a quiet anger at the thought of handing her back to the man who had caused that fear, a man who would finish what he had started if given the chance. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the sharp bones and hollow cheeks, and for a moment he imagined her without fear, imagined her laughter breaking across these walls the way his wife's voice once had. He set the pipe down, leaned forward, and pressed his elbows to his knees. His answer had been waiting all along, buried under grief and habit, but it was clear now. He would not hand her back, not to the stepfather, not to anyone. She might not be his by blood, but she was under his roof, and that was enough. The silence they shared was no longer a curse. It was a bond. Ethan leaned back in his chair, eyes steady on the flames, and though the night outside carried danger, the choice inside was already made. The mornings had grown different since the girl came. Ethan noticed it in the rhythm of the chores, the quiet shuffle of smaller footsteps behind him as he walked the fence line, the way her hands reached for work without needing to be asked. She followed him into the barn, carried water to the trough, and though her arms trembled under the weight of the buckets, she never once set them down until the task was done. He let her help because she wanted to, not because she had to, and he saw how each small effort steadied her, how each chore gave her a little more ground to stand on. One afternoon, the calves needed feeding, restless creatures bawling and bumping against the gate. Ethan handed her a small pail, filled half so it wouldn't be too heavy, and watched as she walked it across the yard. The sun lay warm on her tangled hair, her bare feet kicking up dust as she moved with more determination than strength. She held the pail with both hands, her thin frame bent to the task, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might just make it to the trough without trouble. Then, her foot caught on a rock hidden in the dirt, and the next instant the pail tipped, the contents spilling in a wave across the ground. The girl froze, staring down at the mess, her chest rising and falling fast, as if she expected the sky itself to split open and punish her. She looked at Ethan, eyes wide, ready for the blow that never came. For a long breath, nothing happened. Then the calf, impatient, stepped forward and nosed at the spilled grain, scattering it further. The sight of its awkward eagerness was too much. The girl's lips twitched, her shoulders shook, and then it came, sharp and sudden, a sound that had been buried for too long. A small burst of laughter escaped her throat. Not a word, not even a full laugh, but a short, breathless sound that startled them both. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. He had not heard that sound in years, not from her, not from anyone within these walls. It was thin, rough, almost broken, but it was laughter, alive and real, cutting through the silence like sunlight through storm clouds. The girl clapped a hand to her mouth, as if she could take it back, her eyes darting to him. He said nothing. He only allowed a slow smile to crease the edges of his face, the kind of smile that did not demand more, but simply accepted what had been given. She stared at him, uncertain, then lowered her hand and let out another quiet laugh. Softer this time, almost shy. Ethan looked away, giving her the dignity of her own moment, and turned back to the calves, but inside him something shifted. The ranch no longer felt like a graveyard filled with ghosts and dust. The air seemed lighter, the silence warmer, as if the walls themselves had heard and remembered what it was to hold joy. That night, when she curled near the fire, Ethan caught her smiling faintly at nothing at all, and he knew the sound she had given him that afternoon was more than an accident. It was a beginning. The town was small enough that news traveled faster than wagons, carried on the tongues of men leaning on hitching posts, and women gathering flour at the mercantile. It didn't take long before everyone knew Ethan Cole had taken in a strange girl, one who did not speak, one who clung to his side like a shadow. Some said she was a blessing fallen into his empty house, but more said she was trouble, the kind that had a way of rotting everything it touched. Ethan heard it in the looks when he rode in for supplies, in the whispers that slipped out just loud enough for him to catch. "Cole's got himself a mute," one man muttered outside the blacksmith's, spit striking the dirt for emphasis. "Never seen a child that can't talk unless there's something wrong with her." "One, too," another shook his head, eyes following Ethan as he passed. "Mark me, harboring a runaway like that will cost him his land. Law don't look kindly on men who meddle in family affairs." Ethan said nothing. He never did. He kept his hat low and his voice lower, took what he came for, and rode out without answering a single word. But silence did not shield him from the storm building in town. It came to a head one afternoon, when a rider with a cruel mouth and sharp eyes appeared on the main street. His horse lathered from hard travel. The girl's stepfather. He wasted no time before weaving his story, telling anyone who would listen how his ward had run away, how she was headstrong and disobedient, how she had brought shame to his home and heartbreak to his family. He painted himself as a man wronged, a father figure doing his best to control a wayward child who would rather spit in the face of discipline than accept it. The words rolled off his tongue smooth as oil, practiced and poisonous, and they found ready ears in townsfolk who preferred the comfort of a familiar lie over the weight of an ugly truth. Ethan stood on the boardwalk when the stepfather told his tale before the sheriff. The lawman listened, his weathered face unreadable, eyes moving between the man's pleading words and Ethan's silent frame. The sheriff was no fool. He had seen bruises hidden under sleeves and the hollow look of children who had lived under cruel hands, but suspicion was not enough to unmake a law. He shifted in his boots, spat once into the dust, and told the man he would look into it. That was all. Look into it. Not freedom, not safety. A promise that meant nothing but time. Ethan's jaw tightened as he walked back to his horse. He knew better than to trust the law to shield what it did not understand. Men like the stepfather could bend rules with charm and lies, could dress up cruelty in the clothes of authority. It was only a matter of time before the fight found its way up the trail to his ranch. That evening, as the girl sat by the fire with her shawl wrapped tight, Ethan leaned against the doorframe and looked out into the dark. The town's judgment was already on their backs, heavy as a rope. He knew then that silence would not be enough. Sooner or later, he would have to stand. The night was heavy with heat and the smell of dry earth, the kind of night when even the cattle were restless, shifting in the corral with low, uneasy sounds. Ethan had been sitting by the table, oiling his rifle, when the dogs began to bark sharp and wild. He set the weapon down and stepped outside, his boots crunching against the packed dirt. The moon hung pale and cold, and in its light he saw 3 riders thundering down the trail, their silhouettes harsh against the horizon. His jaw tightened. He had been expecting this. The men reined up hard in front of the house, dust swirling around them. The one in front swung down first, the cruel-mouthed stepfather whose shadow the girl could never escape. Behind him stood 2 others, broad-shouldered, eyes narrowed with the look of hired trouble. The stepfather's hand already gripped the coil of a whip hanging from his belt, its tail dragging the ground. "You got something of mine, Cole," he said, his voice thick with anger and triumph. "A runaway brat who don't know her place. I'll be taking her back tonight." Ethan stood still, his hand resting on the porch post. "She ain't yours to take," he said quietly. "She don't belong to any man who breaks her down, just to watch her bow." The stepfather's mouth curled. "You think you can tell me how to raise what's mine? She's nothing but a mouth too stubborn to use her words. You harbor her, you'll answer for it." He stepped closer, the whip hissing as he pulled it free. Inside the barn, hidden between bales of hay, the girl crouched low, trembling. She had run there at the first sound of hooves, pressing her hands against her ears. But when she heard the voices, when she saw through the crack in the boards the man who had haunted every step of her life, something in her chest twisted. Ethan was out there alone, holding steady, standing between her and the darkness she thought she had left behind. The stepfather raised the whip high, his arm cutting the moonlight, ready to strike. Ethan did not move back, his rifle leaning against the wall behind him, too far to reach before the lash fell. In that instant, something inside the girl snapped like a rope pulled too tight. Years of silence, years of swallowing words until they rotted in her throat, broke open all at once. Her voice tore free, raw and jagged, a sound louder than fear itself. "Stop." The word ripped through the night, echoing off the barn walls, startling the horses, freezing the men where they stood. Ethan's head jerked toward the sound, his eyes wide, the stepfather's arm hanging mid-collar air, stunned by the force of a voice he thought he had stolen forever. The silence that followed was sharp as glass. Ethan seized it. In a single stride he grabbed his rifle, cocked it clean, and leveled it at the men. "You heard her," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "It ends here. You ride out now, or you don't ride at all." The stepfather faltered, his cruel eyes darting from Ethan's steady aim to the barn where the girl stood now in the doorway, her face pale but her jaw firm, the echo of her own words still shaking in her chest. For the first time, he saw not the silent child he could control, but someone beyond his reach. The men shifted uneasily, muttered curses under their breath, then pulled back their reins. The stepfather spat into the dirt, hatred burning in his eyes, but he mounted all the same. "This ain't over," he growled. Yet he turned, and the 3 of them rode off into the night, their figures swallowed by dust and distance. Ethan lowered the rifle slowly, his chest rising with a deep breath. He looked at the girl, her small body trembling, her lips parted as if the word might still escape again. She had spoken, not much, only 1 word, but it was enough to break the chains that bound her. Ethan gave a single nod, not pressing her, not praising, only acknowledging. The fire of her voice had changed everything. The night air was still sharp, with the echo of her scream. The sound of it seemed to hang in the rafters of the barn, and in the dust of the yard, long after the riders had gone. Ethan set the rifle down, the weight of it heavy in his hand, then crossed the yard toward her. She was standing in the barn doorway, her small frame trembling, her lips still parted, as though the word might spill out again if she wasn't careful. Her eyes were wide, uncertain, and she looked at him as if she wasn't sure what she had done, as if speaking had been both a triumph and a sin. Ethan stopped in front of her and went down on one knee, so they were level, his voice steady but low, meant only for her. "That voice is yours," he said. "You can use it or keep it, shout it or whisper it, but it belongs to you. No one will take it from you again, not while you're here." Her throat worked, but no sound came this time. Instead, she clutched at his sleeve, her fingers knotting into the fabric, as though she might fall if she let go. He didn't move, didn't try to pull her closer or push her away, only stayed there until her breathing steadied. Slowly, she nodded, her eyes shimmering in the pale light. For the first time since she had stumbled across his land, she wasn't a runaway anymore. She was someone worth standing up for. They walked back to the house side by side, the silence between them no longer hollow but filled with something new, something almost fragile. Inside, Ethan set another log on the fire, and the flames leapt higher, warming the room against the cold night. The girl sank into her place by the hearth, the shawl slipping from her shoulders as if the weight of it was no longer needed. She pulled her knees to her chest, but this time, her posture was not one of hiding. She seemed to be holding herself steady, bracing against the flood of change that had begun. In the days that followed, the ranch shifted. It was slow at first, but Ethan noticed it in the way her footsteps sounded across the porch boards, quicker and less fearful, in the way the soft scrape of a chair against the floor no longer made her flinch. She began to hum once, while carrying kindling, not a song with words, just a low tune that rose and fell like breath. It startled her when she realized she had done it, but Ethan didn't say a word, only smiled faintly as he mended a harness. The silence that had once made his house feel like a grave now carried different sounds. The patter of her bare feet on the dirt, the thud of a pail set down too fast, even a faint laugh when a calf licked grain from her hand and left her fingers slick with slobber. These were small things, but they filled the empty corners of his home until it no longer felt like a place for ghosts. One evening, as the sun burned low and the sky turned the color of rust, Ethan stood on the porch watching her chase a loose chicken across the yard, her hair flying wild, her thin arms stretched out in stubborn pursuit. When she caught it at last, she turned and grinned at him. Not a laugh this time, not a word, but a grin as bright as any sound. And Ethan, who had lived too long in sorrow, felt his chest ease with a quiet he had not known in years. The ranch was no longer just his, it was theirs. The seasons turned slow on the open plains, each one carrying its own mark upon the land. Spring came with soft rains that settled the dust, filling the gullies with trickles of water and bringing up shoots of grass along the fence lines. The girl crouched by the porch with her hands in the earth, planting flowers Ethan had traded for in town. She worked with care, patting the soil down around each stem as if she were tucking it in for sleep. By summer, the porch bloomed with color, small, bright faces swaying in the wind, a sight Ethan had not known since his wife was alive. Each time he passed them, he felt the weight of the past loosen just a little more. She learned to ride that summer too. At first she clung tight to the saddle horn, her body stiff, her eyes wide as the horse shifted beneath her. Ethan walked alongside, his hand steady on the reins, speaking low to calm both girl and animal. Little by little her back straightened, her hands found balance, and the horse seemed to sense her trust. By autumn, she rode across the yard with her hair streaming behind her, the wind pulling laughter out of her chest before she realized it. Ethan stood at the fence and watched, his face quiet, but his eyes warmed with pride. The ranch began to echo with new sounds. The thud of her hammer when she helped mend the fences, her small grunts of effort when she carried buckets too heavy, even the faint tune she hummed while feeding the chickens. She still spoke rarely, her words guarded and few, but when she did, they were enough. Once she said thank you, the words hushed but clear, when he brought her a new pair of boots. Another time she whispered safe as they sat by the fire. And Ethan thought, no sermon in any church could carry more meaning than that single word. He never called her daughter, never called her ward. Words like that felt too small, too thin for what she had become to him. When others asked, he simply said, she's my own, and left it at that. The title was stronger than blood, stronger than law, born out of the long days and nights when they had chosen not to turn away from one another. Winter came with hard winds, rattling the shutters, but inside the house there was warmth. The girl sat at the table sewing clumsy stitches into a quilt. Ethan mended harness by the fire, and the silence that wrapped around them was no longer hollow. It was peace. It was belonging. She no longer flinched at shadows or the bark of a dog, and he no longer felt the emptiness of walls that once mocked him. They had both been broken once, bent by loss and cruelty. But together they had built something stronger, not by names or papers, not by duty or chance, but by choice. And as the snow fell across the wide fields, Ethan knew the truth of it deep in his bones. Family was not given, it was made. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.